Hi everybody, I hope you're all doing really well. So today I am back to do my best books of 2023, my favourite video to do in any given year, talking about the best books of the previous year. Happy New Year to you all. Though I'm not going to lie to you, as I said, this is usually my favourite video to film. I get so excited about the fact that I can show usually about 10 of my favourite books that I've read. But honestly, when I was putting together this list, I was having a little bit of a hard time really selecting books that I thought were the best of the best. And I think that's just generally because my reading year, while it's not been a bad reading year, it's just generally been a bit of a meh reading year. I noticed in like 2020, 2021, when I first started my channel, that my reading tended to go on either extreme. I would read books that I absolutely loved and were like new all-time favourites, but then I'd also read some absolute stinkers that were like the worst of the worst that I'd read. And to be honest, this year my reading has been kind of stable. In terms of star ratings, a lot of the stuff that I've given this year have been 3 or 4 stars. I don't think I've given any book 1 star this year. My least favourite book that I read this year was probably My Roommate is a Vampire, and even saying that, you know, there were things that I enjoyed in that book, it just overall was not my favourite thing. So that's good. I'm starting to read fewer books that really do annoy me. But I noticed, especially when I reread Jane Eyre, how lacking my reading was for like those top of the top new all-time favourite books were when I was re-listening to Jane Eyre and just getting so excited in a way that most other books this year had not made me. And I was going back over Storygraph, over Goodreads, looking at the previous books that I'd read this year, and just feeling like the list of 10 that I might have created for this year just did not stand up next to the previous years that I've done. There were very few books on that list that I felt really had sunk under my skin and had really latched themselves to my heart, just in comparison to those other years. So as a result of that, my list is a bit shorter this year. It's going to be 6 books instead of 10. I could maybe have done what I did last year and done a whole load of honourable mentions. I think I ended up doing about 20 books in 2022, a top 10 and then 10 honourable mentions. And I don't know, I just feel like I've had a bit of a meh year overall. While there are definitely books that I would recommend you reading, I just don't feel necessarily that they've got a spot on a best of list. And it feels mean to say because, you know, they're not bad books at all. Like I say, I would recommend those books if somebody were to ask me whether or not they're good. But favourite just has a different kind of ring to it. I think especially because I'm thinking about all-time favourite books. Like this coming year, I would like to make an all-time favourite books list. Part of what that means to me is something that really just seeps into me, gets me excited, gets me emotional. And I've just had very few experiences of that this year. So the 6 that I'm going to talk to you about today definitely do fit that bill. So it's a reduced list, but I would still say a good list nonetheless. The first of those 6 great books that I want to talk to you about today is The Secrets of Hartwood Hall by Katie Lumsden. Not only did I have a great reading experience with this, but just the general experience of this book has been fantastic because, of course, this is written by one of BookTube's very own, Katie over at Books and Things, and the experience of seeing her bring out this book, going to her launch event, hearing her talk both in person and through her YouTube videos about her process of writing this book and the inspiration for it has been so enjoyable that it actually made picking up this book seem a little bit intimidating because I was so afraid to not like it. I know that I can be tricky to please when it comes to historical fiction, and I wanted to enjoy this so badly, but I know that I have high expectations. I know that a lot of historical fiction can fall flat for me, and so you can imagine how delighted I was when I started reading this and it was just ticking lots of boxes for me. I've done a whole review video on this one, but every mark that this could have hit in terms of historical fiction and what I want historical fiction to do, it met. A lot of people call this a love letter to the Brontes, a love letter to Gothic fiction, and it absolutely is that, but I also feel like it's a love letter to historical fiction, the historical fiction that if you watch Katie's channel you know that she reads and loves. This is a book that is informed not just by the Brontes, not just by Gothic fiction, but is informed by the books that have come since then, the books that have been inspired by it, and taking the best, the most fun bits and pieces of that and riffing on them in the most beautiful, eloquent way. The language in this book is so clean, so clear, and yet so evocative. There's none of the filler. While the language is beautiful, it is not overly flowery. Nothing detracts away from the central story of this young widowed governess, Margaret Lennox, taking up a governess position at Hartwood Hall, trying to escape her past, trying to make a new start for herself, but finding that this new family, this mother and son, have got secrets of their own and that things are not all what they seem at Hartwood Hall. My entire process of experiencing this book, not just reading it, has been just such a fantastic highlight of this year, and I'm very grateful to Katie for involving me in this, and I'm very much looking forward to her next book, which is more of a comedy of manners inspired by Jane Austen. I love the Brontes, as you know, but I am even more of a fan of Jane Austen and her sense of humour. I don't want to preempt things too much, I don't want to get my hopes up too much, but I do feel like if I loved this one, then I'm going to love The Trouble with Miss Montgomery Hall even more. So sorry to put pressure on Katie, but I am excited. I am excited. Next up, we have The Duchess Deal by Tessa Dare. You will know I was absolutely head over heels for When a Scot Ties the Knot by Tessa Dare, and so I absolutely had to prioritise reading a little bit more of Tessa Dare this year. I ended up reading 3 Tessa Dare books, this, The Wallflower Wager and The Governess Game, which are all in her Girl Meets Duke series, which is tragically unfinished at the current moment. There is one more book still to come out, but Tessa Dare is on a bit of a writing hiatus. We don't know when this next book is coming, but I am eagerly anticipating it because I just love Tessa Dare's writing so much. I love her premises for these romances. I just think she's very fun. So in this book we have our main couple, Emma Gladstone and the Duke of Ashbury. The Duke of Ashbury has returned from the Napoleonic Wars with burns all down the right side of his body and down the right side of his face. As a result of this, his very shallow, clearly, fiancée leaves him, and the Duke, who was once fairly sullen, is now pretty bitter, cynical, and can be downright cruel at times. While he would rather wish to be a recluse, he knows that in order to keep his home and his lands within his family, he must marry and he must sire an heir. He's contemplating all of this when who should stumble into his home but Emma Gladstone, the seamstress who had been working on his fiance's wedding dress, who has now turned up in his home wearing said wedding dress because she has not been paid. Wanting to make a statement, she prances into his room and is like, "This is the work that I've done, please pay me for it." The Duke looks at her, considers for a moment, and then decides to propose to her, because here is a woman who clearly doesn't scare easy, who is clearly a gentleman's daughter but has fallen on hard times, is in dire straits. He knows pretty much that she's not going to refuse him, and so we have this marriage of convenience. Emma goes along with this because obviously it's too good an offer to refuse, but also is very quickly intrigued and attracted to this man, despite his protestations, despite how sullen and crotchety he can be. And as they start to learn more about each other's past, layers to their soul get peeled back, and it's just very good fun. This is a slightly different dynamic to When a Scot Ties the Knot. Captain Logan Mackenzie, you know, is fairly sarcastic, can be a bit bitter and grumpy, but the Duke of Ashbury takes this and times it by 10. It is so very entertaining how sarcastic and bitter this man can be. But you know, layered beneath all of that is a bit of a softie. This Duke also has a quirk of only cursing in Shakespeare. His humour, while very, very dry, is just very funny to me. There is a moment where he goes around and he often will use his burns as a way of scaring people in a kind of like vigilante justice kind of way. And there is a moment in this book where he goes over to somebody's house, I won't spoil who, and pretends to be the devil or like the devil's assistant in order to scare this man. "Who are you? What are you? What do you think?" Ashbury raised his lantern to the gnarled, scarred side of his face and took pleasure in the vicar's anguished whimper. "A demon come to drag you to hell, you miserable wretch." "To hell? Me?" "Yes, you crusty botch of nature, you poisonous bunchback toad, sitting in this weaselly little house, full to reeking with betrayal and," he waved at the nearest shelf, "and ghastly curtains." "What's wrong with the curtains?" "Everything!" he roared. Further along he confirms who it is he's speaking to, and he says, "Thank Pluto, such a nuisance when I cock these things up. It's a devil of a delay when there's so much to be done. Once you arrive in the eternal furnace, there are sinful debts to be settled. Hell to pay is not merely a saying. Then there are the endless papers to be signed and filed." Papers to be filed? Naturally, there are papers. It should surprise no one to learn that hell is a vast, inefficient bureaucracy. He's just very creative. And yeah, like I say, very different personalities of our protagonist to When a Scot Ties the Knot, but very, very enjoyable. I had a lot of fun with this. Another book that I had a lot of fun with, now non-fiction, is Uproar, Satire, Scandal and Printmakers in Georgian London by Alice Loxton. And the reason I love this book and why I want to kind of thrust it into the hands of everybody that I meet is because this is a book, a popular history that I have wanted to exist for so long, looking at the satirical print culture of the late 18th century, particularly looking at James Gilray, Isaac Cruikshank and Thomas Rowlandson. These just very, very funny prints which would lampoon at different politicians and prominent figures of the day, and it only really lasts for around about a generation or so, but they have had such a profound impact on satire, on bringing prominent figures down to earth. They've just generally done a lot for comedy, and I feel like Alice Loxton wrote about this so incredibly well. She's a very funny historical writer, and something that I loved about this is how she would evoke scenes that may have happened. Like, she will create imagined scenes of these historical figures and how they came to create their prints, and obviously she notes that these are not real things that happened, but they're so evocative. The comparison that I made is that the way that she writes about this is almost like she is trying to evoke the sensation of the prints that they were creating, this heightened reality, this cartoonish, exaggerated scenario that, you know, we know didn't actually happen but feels true to life. I do talk about this more in an individual book review video that I did for this, so if you want to learn more then I will link that down below, but such a fantastic book and I very much much looking forward to the next book that is coming out by Alice Loxton, which I believe is all about famous figures and what they had done with their lives before they turned 18, which I just think is a really interesting concept. Next up, a poetry collection on this list is Wearing My Mother's Heart by Sophia Thakur. It's not really a big surprise to me that this was on my list, considering that her very first poetry collection, Somebody Give This Heart a Pen, was on my 2020 favourites list, but this was just such a stunning follow-up. I've mentioned before that Somebody Give This Heart a Pen is very internal based. It's very much thinking about love and friendship, about belonging and identity, but very much, you know, within yourself. Whereas this is such a clever and fantastic follow-up because it takes all of those same journeys, all those same conversations, and kind of projects it externally. Through the title Wearing My Mother's Heart, she's very much thinking of her family and bringing her family, particularly her grandmother and her mother, into the conversation, imagining their lives and the things that happen to them and how they mirror up with her own life, and thinking basically about how we would be nothing without the generations of women who came before us. My grandma's smile was a pebble landing into the satin sheet of a lake, opening the sun into 10 million little waves, reflecting back onto any face lucky enough to experience her light, her rays, never ever ever in vain in our veins. Britain, eagle of the West, wings woven by women who crushed garlic into ghee and gave the streets curry and biryani and kebab. Britain, eagle of the West, claws sharpened by men, migrants, who hoped the bricks they laid could build a home for them too. Britain, eagle of the West, feathers of foreigners, ignorant to what makes you fly. You were an empty seat at my wedding, a silent speech at the reception, a tearless face during my first dance, an empty palm during labour. You were clapping hands that never touched when baby took his first steps, a gap in the air on bonfire night, an uneaten plate at Christmas, silence on the other side of the phone as I call you for the 7th time this week and hold my breath as your answering machine pierces your voice through my heart. And again, I tell you all about my day, imagining the things you'd say. I'm just going to call out into the void, Sophia Thakur, if you're watching this, please bring out more poetry, please. I enjoy it too much. Penultimate book on this list is Elizabeth of York, The Last White Rose by Alison Weir. If you were watching my channel last year, you'll know that I blitzed through the 6 Tudor Queens series by Alison Weir. And in this book, I am going to her newest series, which is on that very Tudor family. This first one in the series looking at Elizabeth of York, who was a daughter of Edward IV, wife to Henry VII, and mother of Henry VIII, who is a figure who I feel like historiography doesn't really tend to care so much about because, you know, and compared to someone like Margaret of Anjou or Margaret Beaufort, Elizabeth Woodville, her mother, she's not quite as present in the historical record. She doesn't have quite as loud a voice, but she lived through so much amazing history, challenges to her father's throne, the death of her father, her uncle Richard usurping the throne, taking it from her brother who should have been Edward V, her brothers being the 2 princes in the Tower who went missing, and despite what some historians, especially this year, will tell you, we still don't actually know what happened to them. There's the Battle of Bosworth, there is her marriage to Henry Tudor, the pretenders, or were they, to his throne, the birth of their various children, including Arthur and Henry, and then her very untimely death on, I think it was her 37th birthday. Despite her young age when she died, she lived through so much history. She was one of the namesakes to Elizabeth I. And Alison Weir just captures this voice and this life so incredibly well. It's very comparable, I would say, to Jane Seymour, her depiction of Jane Seymour, the Haunted Queen, this very internal character who she is now giving voice to. And it really proves how fiction is often the best way to get at some of these quieter historical figures, or at least those who seem in the historical record to be a bit quieter. You're getting a chance to kind of sit in their mind, react to things as they react to them. Just because somebody is quiet in the historical record doesn't mean that they had nothing to say, or the things that were going on were not affecting them. And you know, we'll never actually truly know what Elizabeth of York was doing 100% of the time or how she was feeling. But this felt like it got close. And it was another instance where I was reading the end of this and I was crying because I wasn't ready to be done with her. Even though I knew when it was going to come, I knew what was going to happen, I was still taken aback by it. Same thing happened with Jane Seymour. I think it's also just so tragic. That, yes, it got me rather emotional. And then the final book that I want to talk to you about today, the one that I do think is probably my favourite of the year, is A Terrible Kindness by Jo Browning-Wroe. This was also the first book that I read in 2023. I feel like that's kind of the theme. The first book that I read of any given year is either one of the best books that I read or one of the worst. I'm very much hoping that 2024 is going to be one of the best. Then maybe I should hope for the worst and then things can only get better from there. Never thought about it that way. But in this, we've got the main character of William Lavery, who has just qualified as an embalmer. He is there to celebrate his qualification when we find out that the Aberfan disaster has occurred. And so they are asking for any qualified embalmers to go over to Wales in order to help clean up and prepare the children for burial. That is kind of the inciting incident to this book. But it really does only take up a couple of chapters either end of the book. The middle of this book is talking about William's childhood, in which we see him from around about the age of 10 to 14, training as a chorister at Cambridge, with the hope that he's going to go forward and pursue music as a career. We know, however, because we've seen those first chapters at Aberfan, that he's not going to end up going into that career. He's not going to end up pursuing music. As a child, he's very much being pushed forward into singing by his mother Evelyn, and she very much wants him to not end up in the embalming business like his father, like his uncle. But we know in the Aberfan chapters that he's been estranged from his mother. And so throughout the book, we're trying to piece together what it is that happened. Why is singing no longer a part of William's life? And why is he estranged from his mother? What happened there? And I feel like I can't dig into this book too much without spoiling things, but it's just a really beautiful reflection on a lot of things that I love. We've got music, we've got history, morbidly, we have death, you know, three of my loves: history, music, death. This is one that I've read twice. In fact, I read this at the beginning of the year, and then a couple of months ago I was reading it for our book club. I chose this as our book club pick, and I was leading the discussion on that, and I had such a fantastic time going through this book again that it just ended up pushing this right up to the top for me. This story about this young boy's coming of age, life not panning out as he thought it was going to, and then him slowly, as an adult, having to re-piece things together and learn that just because things didn't pan out as you hoped they would, it doesn't mean that you have to give them up entirely, and learning how his family, music, his friends can still have a place in his life, even though it's not quite as he expected it to. And yeah, I love this, and the more I think about it, the more excited I get. I feel like I'm not doing this justice. Once again, there is a full review video for this book down below, which is much more eloquent than I can be now, but this is both parts devastating and uplifting. As the title suggests, it's a book that is full with a lot of times that people can be incredibly cruel and horrible to each other, but also how we can uplift each other, how we can demonstrate such profound kindness, and how humans are kind of oscillating between both extremes at any given time, especially when we're under moments of stress, and how they can test us. And yeah, this is a book that made me think a lot about humanity. As pretentious as that sounds. So there we go. Those are the 6 favourite books that I read in 2023. Like I say, I am hoping that I'm going to have a much bigger list than this next year. I always set my Goodreads goal at 30 books, and I always do end up surpassing that. I wonder almost if I should set like an internal goal of 30 great books, so 30 books that are like 4 or more stars to me, 4.5s or more on Storygraph. I don't know how feasible that would be. I imagine that would include a lot of DNFing and moving on. Thank you, next. But you know, I need to stop rambling at this point. Do let me know if you've read any of the books I spoke about today. I would love to hear about any of your favourite books of 2023, any that you think I should check out this year. I would love to hear from you. I hope you're having a fantastic day, and I look forward to talking to you again soon. Thanks. Bye.